What's going on, guys? Tim from Tim's Garage here, and I'm stoked today because I'm going to be doing my next little mini mod to my 2018 Triumph Thruxton R, and what that is today is replacing these yellow stock springs on my Ohlins shocks that come on the Thruxton R with these black replacement ones that are going to help to sync up the look a little bit better of the black and metal parts of the bike. I, like a lot of other people, not a huge fan of the yellow shocks. I mean, they do look, or excuse me, yellow springs. They do look sporty, but they are the only yellow thing that's on the bike at all. The bike does have the gold elements of the front Showas and then the reservoirs on the Ohlins. And so I think replacing this with black will just kind of help to clean up that look a little bit and then have that gold that's on the shocks on the rear pop a little bit more. So I'm going to be pulling off the shocks on each side and putting on these new springs. So the first step that I need to do, and I've actually done, is put a center stand jack on the bike carefully to keep it balanced. I've checked it, it's pretty secure. Unfortunately, I don't have any way of tying down the bike to make sure it's not going to fall over, so I just got to be super careful. One thing I always do is just leave the kickstand down in case it decides to go this way. That way, just got to be extra cautious. So now that it's propped up, what I've done and research is that you need to bring it up just enough so the tire is just touching the ground to remove the compression from the springs. And then what you do is you take out the bolt that's down here and the bolt that's at the top, and the shock just comes right out. And the way to do this is you're going to do one side at a time because you don't want the wheel just to come falling down. It's good just to do one at a time and then put them back to make it easy for you to uninstall and reinstall. So I'm going to go ahead and get the shock taken out, and then we'll talk about how we're going to get the spring in next. To get this lower bolt removed is super simple. You're just going to need your socket and your wrench, and both of these are just 14 mil. I'm just going to put these on here like this. Super simple. And then the stud comes out, and you can see that the shock is now free. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw this bolt back in just so it's holding it in place, and then keep the nut off to the side, and then I'm going to work on the top. Okay, so now we've got both bolts removed. I'm going to take the bottom one out, and boom, there's the shock. So you can see it's easy to remove, and again, I'm going to do one side at a time here so that I'm keeping the wheel stable and in place. Again, you don't want to try to mess with anything that's going to knock the bike off the stand. So shock is removed. Next step is compressing this to get the spring off. All right, I've got the ratchet straps tight, so now I'm just trying to figure, got the clip out. Okay, cool. So now, if I go and release the spring, and I'm holding the base, pop. There we go. Yellow spring is off. We just slide the black one on now in reverse order. And now, since I have this off, I'm actually going to go ahead and just clean this up a little bit and just make sure this all looks good in here. It obviously picks up a lot of dust as the bike is being used, so get that clean and then put the new spring in. Okay, so I've got the black spring now in place, and one thing to remember is that the tighter pack springs in this orientation are toward the bottom, which is actually toward the top of the shock. And in case you're curious, go take a look at your other shock that you still have on the bike, and that's another reason why you do one at a time, so you can make sure that they look the same. So now that this is in, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the ratchet straps down here and then slip the clip ring back in, and we're done with this side. Okay, so this side's done. Got the retainer clip back in, and that's what it looks like with the black spring. Pretty clean. Now we'll go put this on the bike and take the one off the other side. Okay, so we're back at the rear of the bike. Gonna go ahead and slip the shock back on here and rest it in there. I'm gonna grab my top bolt. Get that started. get that snug for now. I want to be able to move it around to get the bolt in at the bottom. And that's the next one. All right, so for the next step here, we want to put the bolt and the nut back on the end. We're just going to slide that through the shock. Oh, and this is something I thought might happen. There's a sleeve here that sits inside of the swing arm. You can see that guy. And it sits right in here for the bolt to slide through, like that. As I was pushing the bolt through, it popped out. But it sits right in the back here. So you want to like try to get the bolt through and then get the nut on, and then eventually it'll tighten down. So I'm gonna get this popped in. There we go. So with the sleeve sticking out a little bit, I was able to get the nut on, and now we just tighten this down. All right, that side is done. All right, so the right side of the bike is virtually the same as the left. The only nuance is you have the chain guard here that's kind of in the way. Some people actually take the chain guard off. There's a couple bolts. There's one here and then one in the front to remove it. But I'm not gonna do that because you can actually really just take your 14mm spanner and drop it in here to grab the nut. And then take your socket and put it on the side here. And you should be able to remove it relatively easily. You just wanna be careful not to scratch. And one good thing you could actually do is just take a rag. We'll just do that real quick. Drop it around the chain guard and the shock so that we don't scratch it up. And then get that spanner back in there. And your nut drops right out. So this side is now loose, and we'll move on to the top. And there we go. Time to swap that one out. Well, all right, guys, so the black spring project is done, and I must say I am really happy with how that looks. Just like I've seen on some other people's bikes. It's super clean now with the black to match the rest of the bike, and then those reservoirs really pop on the Ohlins now and got rid of the only yellow thing that was on the bike. So I think that this is really, really sharp. As I mentioned, what I did was do one side at a time, and there's two reasons why I did that. First reason was because of safety. You just want to take one off at a time to make sure that this wheel isn't completely free when you've got it all lifted off the ground like this. It's just like the least amount of things that you can do to mess with that, the better. And two, it gives you the ability to actually look at the gaps in between the adjusters on the preload here on both shocks. And the reason you want to do that is because when you're taking the spring off, these actually can spin pretty free once the spring is out and loose. So it's good to have a look at that and be able to go back and forth to make sure that you didn't mess with that too much on the preload. And then once the springs are in and the shocks are back in place, you could also double check your adjustments because again, these are fully adjustable shocks. Nothing should have changed up here. It's possible you might have messed with the settings down here. So it's good to get everything back to 0 and then just reset it so you're in good shape there. And then lastly, as I was putting the shocks back in, I mentioned that I loosely put in all the hardware, but then I tightened the stuff down. The lower is at 48 Newton meters and the upper was at 28 Newton meters. So with that, I'm gonna call the project done. I was gonna say it's interesting using a ratchet strap to compress the springs. It can be a little scary, but just make sure you're using gloves and you're keeping it stable. It actually helps to have a second pair of hands with that. So if you got a buddy to help you out, it makes it so much easier to pop that little retaining clip off and then put it back in. But once you get the hang of it, it's not the most difficult thing in the world. So with that, we'll call the Ohlins black spring swap on the Thruxton complete.